Hi, it's Paul Duvall, Chief AWS Evangelist at Emphasis and a founder of Stelligent. So in a blog post, I've walked through a process in which you can test whether or not your CloudFormation templates are still working using a tool called TaskCat. And what's more is I've automated the whole process. So I'll walk you through all the steps so you can do this yourself in your AWS account. So I'm using a few AWS services and some other tools as well. So one of the tools I'm using is AWS CodeBuild, which is a fully managed build service. And I have a couple of CodeBuild projects that I've defined. One actually runs TaskCat itself, installs Python, which TaskCat uses, configures it, installs and configures TaskCat, and then runs the TaskCat tests, in this case, creating and deleting a CloudFormation template to verify that it's still working. And then the other CodeBuild project I'm using is based on the dashboard that TaskCat creates. It's a HTML file, and so it pushes that up to S3, makes that available for you to view. Then I'm using AWS CodePipeline to define a deployment pipeline in which it gets any changes from GitHub, a GitHub repository that you'll create, and then it runs through those couple of CodeBuild projects. And then as a part of that, publishes those results. And it's running TaskCat as a part of that. And then I'm also automating the whole process as well. And so AWS CloudFormation allows me to define my AWS infrastructure as code. So I'm defining that as a template. And it's there that I'm defining my CodeBuild projects, also my CodePipeline, IAM permissions, S3 buckets, and things like that. And then I'm using AWS Secrets Manager, which allows me to store secrets in an encrypted manner. And so I have a GitHub personal access token that I need to pass into CodePipeline. So I want to do that in a secure manner. So I just walk through the process of creating a secret in which we're going to store our GitHub personal access token, and then be able to pass that into the CloudFormation template that then you're going to run. Then I'm using GitHub to store all these files, the CloudFormation template, the TaskCat configuration, built spec file, things like that. And then, of course, we're running TaskCat, which is that open source tool provided by the AWS Quick Start team. If you've been using CloudFormation for any period of time, and I've been using it since the beginning, so about 9 years now I've been using it, you know that even if you've created a CloudFormation template that's working at first, because it has dependencies on configuration, versions, other services, things like that, once it's working doesn't mean it's working, a week or two after the fact, like most software systems. And so TaskCat allows us to test whether or not our CloudFormation templates continue to run. And so, again, in this solution, I'm just packaging all this together and so that you can run it in your own AWS account and verify that your suite of CloudFormation templates are continually able to run across the different regions that you've configured. So we're going to do this in a couple ways. First, you're going to be able to run TaskCat from the command line. Then you're going to walk through the process of then automating the whole deployment pipeline, the whole continuous delivery process as well. And so that you don't have to manually type those commands every single time. Everything can be in code, and it can run as a part of continuous delivery process. So the first thing we'll do is we're going to create a Cloud9 IDE. If you're using a different IDE, if you're using it on your local machine or what have you, I'd recommend just walking through the steps in Cloud9 at first, and then you can make the modifications. The reason I'm doing it this way is so it's consistent, it looks the same for everyone, and then I can refer to specific directories and things like that. So first thing we'll do is go to the AWS console. We'll go to Cloud9. We'll create an environment. I'm going to call it TaskCat example. You can call it what you want. I click on next step. I'm going to leave all the defaults, and then I'm going to create the environment. And this takes about a minute or two. It's actually launching an EC2 instance at first, and that's what Cloud9 is going to be running on. And so we'll wait for it to launch our IDE. Now that the Cloud9 IDE has launched, we'll go back to the instructions. And here we're going to run through a few commands. We're going to download pip, which is the package manager for Python that TaskCat needs. in order to install TaskCat, you need that. And so we'll run through these commands. This takes a minute or two to download all these files. Okay, so now we're going to get pip. So pip is similar to npm or your Maven repository or Ruby gems, what have you. So we're going to get pip and then install it and upgrade it. Okay, so now that that's installed, we're going to install TaskCat. Okay, so now that TaskCat is installed, let's just make sure we have the right version. So based on this blog post, you need to use at least version 0.9. I'm using 0.98, but there are a number of changes in the 0.9 version. You'll see some previous blog posts and also even some of the AWS examples that refers to a different way to set up TaskCat and run commands against it. Okay, so now we're going to create a GitHub repository, and so we're going to go off to GitHub. In my case, I'm just going to go right to my GitHub account, go to my repository, my list of repositories, and then I'm going to type in TaskCat example. Make it public. Initialize a README and create the repository. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to Cloud9 and I'm going to git clone this. And so let's type this, git clone, just paste in the name of my repository. Then I'm going to cd. Okay, so now I have access to my local repository based on the GitHub repo. I'm going to create a couple of empty files in this repository. Okay, so I'm creating a TaskCat. This is a YAML file. It's a configuration to identify how we want to run TaskCat. And then the SQS YAML file is just a really simple, you'll see in a moment, CloudFormation template. And that's the CloudFormation template that we're going to actually run to verify it's still working. And so I'm going to copy this CloudFormation template. I'm going to open up SQS YAML file, paste that in, and then save it. And you can see it's just creating one resource as an output. Really simple. Then I'm going to go back into Cloud9, and this is the TaskCat configurations.taskcat YAML file. And here we define a project and some tests. And the project name can be, whatever you want to name this. I'm going to name it the same as my repository. And then one of the properties here is a region, and so I can pass in a list of regions. In this case, I want to pass in more than one, so I'm not making any assumptions against one specific region, but also I don't want to pass in a bunch of regions. This really depends on how you want to run your test and where you want it to be supported. In this case, I just want to run through a simple example that reduces any assumptions that I might have in my CloudFormation template. And then here I run the tests, and so I give it a logical name, and then I pass in the template based on the location that it's in. And what this is going to do is when I run the TaskCat command, then it's going to run all the tests that are listed under tests. In this case, it's going to launch this CloudFormation. It's going to launch a CloudFormation stack in each of these regions based on this template. And so, again, really simple, but this is essentially what you do for most of your TaskCat tests. So now we're going to run this from the command line. First, let me just go over a couple of items to note with TaskCat. One is that you can pass in parameters. So, most CloudFormation templates have parameters that you can pass in to customize the behavior. And so this is an example of I have a test and I have this logical name, and then I'm passing in, this is a keyword for TaskCat in this configuration file called parameters. And then this is the name of one of the parameters in this CloudFormation template. And so then I'm passing in what's known as a TaskCat token. And TaskCat, right now there's around 8 or so tokens. And so in this case, I'm generating an availability zone name. And in this case, I'm generating just one availability zone name. So I could say, I could put gen az underscore 3 and create 3 availability zone names I can pass in as a list, as a parameter to the CloudFormation template when I'm creating that CloudFormation stack. And so there's around 8 tokens. You can generate UUIDs, you can generate passwords and things like that, so that you can run this without needing to always be right there at the command line, passing in various custom parameters and what have you. And so this is a way to customize how you use a TaskCat. So while there are multiple commands that you can run with TaskCat, we're going to run the most basic and most frequently run command you'll be running. So we're just going to write TaskCat test run. So we'll copy this. And we'll paste it. Before we do that, we're just going to make sure we saved everything. So we have the SQS YAML file and the TaskCat. And it's going to actually run through some linting. It's going to make sure that it pass any of the lint tests. If it fails, it will identify. And now it's starting to create those CloudFormation stacks based on my template. And it's creating one in USD East 1 as identified in the configuration file. And then it's creating another in US East 2, also as identified in the configuration file. So it's going to create these stacks, and then it's going to delete those stacks once it's created. And so we can go to the CloudFormation dashboard. We can see that it's created this CloudFormation stack. And so once it's finished with this, then it's going to run through some steps to actually delete those stacks automatically for us. So all we're doing is running TaskCat test run, and it's going to run whatever is in the configuration file that we've identified. Okay, so we can see that it's successfully created and deleted those stacks, and it's also created this folder called TaskCat outputs. And so we can right-click and in preview, we can launch this index HTML file, and we can see this is a TaskCat dashboard. We can see that it's run this CloudFormation stack in 2 different regions. It's successfully created those. If we wanted to, we could click on the view logs, and it's going to go to the CloudWatch logs. Especially if there are any errors, we can find and we can diagnose the errors and troubleshoot them and so on. And so, so those are the basic steps in running TaskCat from the command line. And so we can see the results here. And so now what we're going to do is we're going to create a pipeline in order to run TaskCat, and we're going to walk through all the automation that you'll be able to create in walking through these steps. So step 1, prerequisites, need to have an AWS account. You should have one if you've gone through these steps, and then the proper IAM permissions. The next thing we're going to do is you can set up a GitHub personal access token. I'm going to make the assumption that you have this already set up. But if you don't, there's some steps for doing that as identified here. What we're gonna do now is create a secret in Secrets Manager, and that secret's going to be that personal access token. And so I've already created one, but I'll walk through the process so you can get familiar with this. And so we're going to store a new secret. You can see the various options here. We're going to select the other types of secrets. We're going to click on the plain text pane here, and this is where you would define your GitHub token. Of course, it's going to be something different. It's going to be a bunch of letters and numbers that are generated for you when you create the personal access token and give the proper permissions to it. We're going to leave the default encryption key here, click on next, and then here's where we're going to define, this is important, that you define this particular name here, and I'm going to give it a different name just to because I already have one created. But this is going to be used by the CloudFormation template. So if you do have a different name that you're defining here, you just need to make sure that you update that CloudFormation parameter in that CloudFormation template. Here we're going to keep the disable automatic rotation. We're going to keep that disabled. And the reason is because it's actually generated, the secret is generated by GitHub. So we don't want it to automatically rotate through AWS. I'm going to leave that. So the whole point of this is to have this in one location. It's in an encrypted format. We can limit access to the secret. So we're going to click on next. And if you're going through this process, you would click on store. I'm going to skip that. I don't want to create an additional secret that I'm not going to use. So since I already have that created, next thing we're going to do is create a couple of empty source files, and we'll fill those out. So we'll go back to Cloud9, clear things out. In this TaskCat example directory, I'm going to just create a couple of empty files here. And then now we're going to populate those. So the build spec file is a file based on specification from CodeBuild. And so in my build spec file, I'm running the commands that are going to be called by the CodeBuild service. So I can click on the contents here. I can select all. I go back into Cloud9, and I open up the empty build spec YAML file. So we can see, identify the version here, identify some phases, and then identify the artifacts that need to be generated from CodeBuild. So I'm using version 0.2. And then I have an install phase. In the install phase, I can identify which programming platform language I want to use. Because TaskCat uses Python, and I want to use version 3.7, I define that in the runtime versions. And this is based on, in the CloudFormation template, I identify what type of build container I want to run. And I'm identifying I want to use a Amazon Linux 2 build container. And so this is just identifying the runtime version that is installed here. And so here I'm just double checking my version, things like that, and outputting it. But the key thing is that I'm installing pip, that package manager like NPM and RubyGem and so forth, making sure I have the latest and greatest. Then I'm installing from pip, I'm installing TaskCat. And then here's the key command where I'm running TaskCat. And it's going to run whatever's in the TaskCat YAML file that I've identified already. But it's going to be running that as a part of the code build execution. And so I'm going to save that off. And then the next one I'm running this is the full automation of the whole solution. So it's called Pipeline TaskCat YAML, but it's also creating the S3 bucket resources. It's creating a couple CodeBuild project resources. You'll see those in a moment. IAM permissions, the pipeline itself. And so we'll click on this. We're going to select all, copy it, go back into Cloud9 IDE, paste this, and we'll just walk through this briefly. So we have a few parameters that it's defining. I have some defaults here just for me. When you actually launch this CloudFormation stack, you'll be passing in some GitHub repository and user that's going to be different based on your AWS or based on your GitHub account. And here is important. This is how it's resolving the secrets manager secret. So it's referring to that GitHub personal access token. So again, if you created something with a different name, then you'll just need to change that here. But otherwise, it's going to, in an encrypted manner, it's going to get the value of that GitHub token that you stored previously in Secrets Manager. So here we're defining the S3 bucket. This is an S3 bucket that's going to store the TaskCat dashboard, the HTML files and associated files for the TaskCat dashboard. Then we're defining the IAM permissions. And then we're defining the actual one of the first CodeBuild projects. And so this is the project that actually runs TaskCat. So we're saying we're running this in Linux. We're running this in a small container. We're running this on Amazon Linux 2. And then as we saw before in the build spec file, that's where it's identifying it's going to be running Python. And then we have another CodeBuild project. Actually, before I get to that, I want to mention that because it doesn't identify a build spec file, it's going to look for a build spec.yaml file. This is the default behavior of CodeBuild. And so there's kind of three different ways to run commands in CodeBuild. One is through a build spec file by default. The other one is to identify the name of the build spec file. It just still has to adhere to the build spec specifications. And then the other one is, as I'm doing in this other code build project, in which I'm actually embedding the commands within the build spec, build spec property off of it's a complex type off of the source property. And so here all I'm doing is I'm getting the task outputs and then copy them up to that S3 bucket that I created previously, and then making it publicly readable, so that you can then just simply look at the TaskCat dashboard. I zip everything up and have an index file, and then I define the pipeline itself in CodePipeline. I'm getting the latest out of the GitHub repository that you went through before that we created, identify some configuration associated with that. Then here is where I'm running CodeBuild, and I'm running that CodeBuild test project. And so that was the first one I showed you, and this is the logical name that I gave to it in this CloudFormation template. So it's just referencing that. And then it generates any output artifacts that I can then use as input artifacts later on. So it generates these TaskCat artifacts, uses those as input artifacts in that next code build project, which is the website or that TaskCat dashboard that gets generated and pushed up into S3. And then I'm just identifying where I'm storing all my code pipeline related files that are encrypted in S3. And then I have a couple of outputs. One is the pipeline URL. So after the CloudFormation template successfully is created, I can click on the outputs and then click on this link that gets generated and go right to the pipeline itself. Then after the successful invocation of that pipeline, this particular link will be available, and this is a link to that dashboard. Okay, so now I'm going to commit the files into GitHub, but actually before I do that, what I want to do is create a git ignore file. So I'm going to create an empty git ignore file. And the reason I'm doing this is because this TaskCat underscore outputs folder, we don't want to commit that into the GitHub repository. It's going to always be changing, so we want to use whatever's locally available, and we don't want to commit those files at any point in time into the GitHub repository. And so we're going to add this particular listing. So I could files, I could put wildcards, I could put folders. As I'm doing in this case, I'm going to save this. And that way, when I type in a git add, then it's going to add all the files except for what's in the git ignore file. And then I can run this command. And so I'm going to actually commit these files. And I'm going to put my password in. And this will be your personal access token, most likely, or your password. So I've committed all those files, and so I can go back into my repository on GitHub, and I can refresh this, and I can see all the files got committed there. So I can see I got the populated build spec file and so forth. Okay, so now I'm going to launch the CloudFormation stack. So I can take this command here, and then the only thing I'm changing is, the only thing you'll be changing is the name of the GitHub user, because if you created the repository with this name, then you don't need to modify that. And then in my case, as I have up here, I just have the name of my GitHub account. And so I'm going to copy that, go back into Cloud9. I'm going to run the command. And now it's generating that CloudFormation stack. I can refresh. I can see that it's now starting to generate that CloudFormation stack. It's going to take a minute or two to run through that, and then we can click on the outputs to launch the pipeline. Okay, so we can see that the pipeline or the CloudFormation stack has successfully launched, and a pipeline has been generated. And so we can go to the outputs pane here. We can see that it's generated a couple of these outputs. One is the pipeline URL, the other is the TaskCat dashboard URL. I can click on the pipeline. We can see that it's running through that pipeline. It's getting the latest from the GitHub repository. I can click on this and it goes right to that repository. And then it's running through that TaskCat CodeBuild project, in which it's actually going to create that CloudFormation stack in each of those regions, and then delete those stacks, and then it's going to then generate that dashboard or create that S3 bucket that will make that dashboard available to us. Okay, so now if I go to the TaskCat dashboard, because it's not finished, you're going to get an error or something like this. And so once it's gone through a successful invocation of this pipeline, then this will be available and we'll be able to refresh it and we'll see the TaskCat dashboard available to us. Okay, so you can now see that it's gone through a successful invocation of that pipeline. If I want to, I can, at any point in time, I can just go right into the TaskCat configuration file, start adding some tests, add parameters or tokens, or and then I can just commit those changes into the GitHub repository. This pipeline then will then pick them up and then run through those additional tests in which it's going to create and delete those CloudFormation stacks against the regions that are listed in that configuration file. So this makes it really extensible, and you don't have to manually run these commands every single time. And also the last part here is if I refresh this, you can see that it's made this TaskCat available, this TaskCat dashboard available to me. And so I can click on the logs and diagnose if anything does happen to go wrong. And so what I've shown you is really an end-to-end process of automating from check-in to when someone commits some code into GitHub, and then it launches CodeBuild to run through the TaskCat test. So you can test your CloudFormation templates really anytime you want. You can set it up to run on a periodic basis. You can customize it based on parameters, tokens that you might need to pass into. So it's a really extensible framework. It's something that I've actually tried to create a couple of years ago because it was a need, because I could see that the CloudFormation templates were failing even though I wasn't making any changes to them. And so this is a really great tool, and when you couple this with some of these other AWS services I went over, like CodeBuild and CodePipeline, you can really make it such that it's an extensible solution that you can scale to meet the needs of a large organization. Make sure not just the software for your end users is working, but also for your end users that happen to be your internal infrastructure engineers and so forth. So I'd love to hear how you're using this and how you made perhaps any changes to it. So you can reach out to us at Emphasis on Twitter or at Stelligent. You can also reach me at Paul Duvall. We'll make all this available. Actually, they are available on the blog post. But thanks a lot for watching.